In today's shadowy tale, a man named Edward pays the ultimate price for love. Would you do the same? In the quaint yet sombre landscape of Norfolk in England, where the North Sea whispers tales of old, there lived a man named Edward Grant. His life, once filled with the simpler joys of rural living, had turned into a heart-wrenching saga of despair. His beloved wife, Amelia, lay in their modest home, stricken with an illness that defied both explanation and cure. For months, Edward had traversed the gamut of modern medicine. The local doctors, with their furrowed brows and sympathetic glances, had tried everything, from traditional treatments to experimental therapies. Nothing seemed to work. Amelia's condition only worsened, her once vibrant spirit now a flickering candle in the wind. As desperation set in, Edward's skepticism gave way to a willingness to try anything. He scoured the internet, delved into old books, and even consulted eccentric healers who practiced forgotten arts. But every effort ended in disappointment, the shadow of hopelessness growing ever larger. Then, one fateful evening, Edward stumbled upon a forum discussing alternative healing methods. A post caught his eye, written by someone claiming to have witnessed miraculous recoveries through voodoo practices in Haiti. Skeptical, yet intrigued, Edward dug deeper, learning about the ancient religion and its mysterious rituals. The more he read, the more he felt an inexplicable pull towards the unconventional paths. In a blend of desperation and hope, Edward decided to take the most unorthodox step in his life. He reached out to a voodoo priest, a man named Jean-Baptiste, known in hushed tones among certain circles for his powerful and controversial healing methods. Edward sent a message detailing Amelia's condition and their failed attempts at a cure, pleading for any help Jean-Baptiste could offer. To his surprise, Jean-Baptiste responded quickly. His message was brief, but filled with a confidence that Edward hadn't seen in any doctor's eyes. He promised to visit Norfolk and assess Amelia's condition, claiming that voodoo, with its deep connection to the spiritual world, could offer what modern medicine could not. As Edward awaited Jean-Baptiste's arrival, a mix of fear and hope battled within him. He knew the path he was about to embark upon was fraught with skepticism and danger. Yet, as he watched Amelia's pale face, her breath shallow and labored, he knew he had no other choice. For her, he would walk into the unknown, into a world where the lines between life, death, and the beyond were blurred. In the heart of Norfolk, a door was about to open to a realm that Edward never believed existed. The quaint streets of Norfolk seemed to hold their breath as Jean-Baptiste, the voodoo priest, made his way towards Edward Grant's humble abode. Accompanying him was a figure that can only be described as haunting, a tall, gaunt man with an eerily devoid expression, trailing silently behind Jean like a shadow. This was Guile, a presence that seemed to command both awe and unease. As they approached the house, Edward's heart pounded with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The moment John stepped onto the property, his eyes, sharp and discerning, scanned the surroundings, as if absorbing the very essence of the place. Without wasting a moment, John asked to see Amelia. Edward, his voice a mix of hope and fear, led the priest to where his wife lay. The room felt heavy, the air thick with the scent of medicine and despair. Amelia, once the very picture of vitality, now lay frail and ghostly on the bed. Jean approached her with a solemnity that seemed to transcend the room's gloom. He placed his hands gently on Amelia, closing his eyes as if in deep communion with unseen forces. After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, he opened his eyes and spoke. "Her soul is lost. We must reclaim it." The words hit Edward like a wave. Lost soul? Reclaim? Concepts were foreign, yet in his heart He knew they were true. Jean continued, "It will take all my power, but I am sure I can help her." His voice held a certainty that was both frightening and reassuring. "Anything," Edward replied, his voice barely a whisper, word carrying the weight of his desperation. Jean nodded. "I'll need to go to my private retreat to gather my strength. In the meantime, I'll leave Guile here to guard over her." His gaze shifted towards the tall, silent figure by the door. Edward's eyes followed, landing on Guile, who stood like a sentinel, his presence both imposing and protective. "Don't worry, there is no better protector," Jean assured him. As the priest left, Edward felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. Guile, now the sole guardian of the room, stood over Amelia with an unwavering vigilance, resembling less a man and more a spectral guardian. "Now we're going to have a short scare break while you ease your nerves. So while you're waiting, don't forget, if you're enjoying the content, go ahead and stab that subscribe button right now. As doing so, you'll really help the professor spread his shadow of evil. Now, let's get back to the story." Attempting to break the heavy silence, Edward ventured, "Can I get you anything, Guile?" His voice echoed slightly in the quiet room, but there was no response. Guile remained silent, his gaze fixed on Amelia, his expression unchanging. Edward realized that this was no ordinary man, but perhaps another aspect of the mysterious world he had invited into his home. As the hours ticked by, with Guile's silent vigil and Amelia's shallow breathing the only sounds in the room, Edward found himself pondering the unknown forces he had sought out. What powers did Jean possess? What realms did he traverse to reclaim a lost soul? And most importantly, would Amelia return to him, whole and healed from the extraordinary journey into the depths of voodoo magic? The answers lay hidden, shrouded in the mysteries that Jean-Baptiste and his silent guardian Guile had brought into his Norfolk home. The clock struck midnight in the Grant household, the sound echoing through the silent corridors like a harbinger to the unknown. In the dimly lit room where Guile stood guard, a miraculous yet eerie event unfolded. Amelia, who had been motionless and unresponsive for weeks, suddenly stirred. Her eyes opened, revealing a vacant gaze, devoid of the living spark that once defied her. Without a word or a sign of struggle, Amelia rose from her bed. Her movements were fluid, yet unnatural, as if she were being guided by an unseen force. Guile, the ever-watchful guardian, observed silently, his stoic demeanor unchanging. As Amelia walked towards the door, Guile followed, maintaining a close, yet respectful distance. The night air was cool and crisp, the stars overhead shining like a myriad of unblinking eyes witnessing the surreal procession. Together, they traversed the quiet streets of Norfolk, moving with purpose, yet without hurry. The destination was unclear, but the path seemed known to Amelia, or whatever force drove her. They soon approached a small, isolated dwelling nestled away from the main thoroughfare. The dwelling, quaint and unassuming, seemed to await their quiet arrival. As Amelia neared the doorway, it opened, revealing a man dressed in white. His face, illuminated by the soft light from within, registered a mix of surprise and fear upon seeing Guile. "No!" The man's voice was firm, yet tinged with panic. He looked directly at Guile, who instinctively moved to position himself between Amelia and the man. The man in white, realizing the gravity of the situation, whispered some strange, indecipherable words, and quickly shut the door, as if to ward off an unwanted presence. At that moment, Amelia's strength gave out, and she collapsed to the ground, her body once again lifeless and frail. Guile, swiftness that belied his gaunt appearance, scooped her up with ease. He carried her back to her room, his expression still as impassive as the night sky. Back in her bed, Amelia lay as if nothing had happened, the only evidence of the night's events being the slight disarray of her blankets. Guile resumed his position by her side, the silent sentinel in the quiet room. Edward, unaware of the nocturnal journey, slept fitfully, haunted by dreams of shadows and whispers. The night's happenings remained a secret between Amelia, Guile, and the mysterious man in white. As dawn approached, the questions and mysteries deepened. Who was the man in white? And what power did he hold to dismiss Guile with mere words? And what force had driven Amelia to seek him out under the cover of night? These questions hung in the air, as tangible yet elusive as the morning mists that began to settle over Norfolk. The morning sun cast a soft glow over Norfolk, a stark contrast to the shadowy events of the previous night. Edward, still lost in the maze of his untroubled thoughts, was startled by a knock on the door. He opened to find Jean-Baptiste standing on his doorstep, his face etched with a stern look that immediately conveyed the gravity of the situation. Without a word of greeting, Jean commanded, "Let me see Guile." His tone broke no argument, and Edward quickly led him to where Guile stood by Amelia's bedside, as unmoving and inscrutable as ever. Jean locked eyes with Guile, peering deeply into his pale, expressionless face. After a moment, he let out a low understanding. Ah, as if a puzzle piece had fallen into place. The fog lifts, he muttered to himself, then turned to Edward with a grave expression. Someone is playing with forces they do not understand, John declared, his voice laced with a mix of concern and frustration. He then asked Edward a question that seemed to come out of nowhere. "Do you have any rivals for Amelia?" Edward, taken aback, responded quickly and empathetically, No. Really? John eyed him with curiosity. Someone has taken her soul in an old ritual. Edward's heart sank at these words. The situation was far more dire than he had imagined. The thought of someone intentionally harming Amelia was both frightening and enraging. "We can get it back, but there's a cost," Jean continued, his gaze never leaving Edward's. "Whatever it is, I'll pay it," Edward said without hesitation, his mind conjuring images of financial sacrifice, selling assets, anything for Amelia's recovery. "It's not money," Jean replied, his voice lowering to a tone that carried the weight of unspoken truths. Edward felt a chill run down his spine. If not money, then what? The thought of a non-monetary price filled him with a deep unease. He realized that the path he had chosen to walk with Jean-Baptiste was one of unknowns and immeasurable risks. Jean's eyes, which had seen much in his lifetime of dealing with the spiritual and the supernatural, held a seriousness that made Edward brace himself for what was to come. The voodoo priest was about to reveal the cost of reclaiming a soul, a price that Edward feared was far more personal and daunting than any amount of money. The air in the room thickened with anticipation and dread as Jean prepared to unveil the nature of the sacrifice required to save Amelia. In the dimly lit room where Amelia lay, a sense of urgency began to build as Jean-Baptiste revealed the dire nature of her condition. "Someone has removed her life, her soul," he stated gravely. "They seek to control her body as well." Edward's heart raced, his mind grappling with the severity of Jean's words. The thought of Amelia being manipulated like a puppet was both horrifying and infuriating. He looked at his wife, lying so still and lifeless, and felt a surge of determination to do whatever it took to save her. Jean continued, his voice steady but laced with caution. "Guile knows the way. but I dare not let him leave her side. His gaze shifted to the silent guardian, whose presence in the room felt like a bulwark against unseen dangers. We'll have to venture out to this mysterious person, Jean declared, turn his attention back to Edward. The journey will be perilous, and the forces we are dealing with are ancient and powerful. Are you prepared for this? Edward, though scared, knew there was no other choice. Yes, I'll do whatever it takes, he replied, his voice firm despite the fear that clung to his heart. Jean nodded, understanding the resolve in Edward's words. We must be cautious and wise. This isn't just a battle for Amelia's soul. It's a confrontation with forces that many dare not speak of. We're dealing with a practitioner of dark arts, someone who knows how to bend the spiritual realm with their will. As Jean laid out the plan, Edward listened intently, ready to embark on this daunting quest. The thought of confronting someone capable of such dark deeds was terrifying, but the love for his wife bolstered his courage. As night began to fall, Jean and Edward set out, leaving Guile as an unwavering guardian by Amelia's side. They travelled through the darkened streets of Norfolk, each step taking them deeper into a world that was far removed from the mundane realities they were accustomed to. The journey ahead was shrouded in mystery and danger, but Edward's resolve never wavered. He was ready to face whatever lay ahead, to challenge the darkness with the light of his unwavering love for Amelia. The night air was thick with the sense of an impending confrontation, a battle not just for a soul, but for the very essence of what it means to be bound by love and faced with the darkest of forces. Under the cloak of night, Jean and Edward arrived at a decrepit old house. The building, cloaked in shadows and years of neglect, seemed to hold secrets in its very walls. Jean, with a sense of purpose, marched up to the door and banged on it. The door creaked open and a man appeared. To Edward's shock, he recognized the man immediately. "Oh, it's Brian," he muttered under his breath, his mind racing to piece together the puzzle. Brian, looking equally astonished to see Edward, stood frozen on the doorstep. "We've known Brian for many years. Him and Amelia go way back," Edward explained to Jean, his voice tinged with confusion and growing sense of unease. Jean wasted no time. "You have something that does not belong to you," he accused Brian directly, his eyes piercing. "No idea what you're talking about," Brian retorted, his voice carrying a hint of defensiveness. Jean's expression hardened. "Release it now, or the next visit will be that of Guile, whom you've already met." Edward stood beside Jean, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. He couldn't fathom the connection between Brian and Amelia's current plight. Suddenly, Brian's facade cracked. "She should be mine," he blurted out, his voice laced with bitterness and longing. Edward turned sharply to face Brian. "Amelia?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We had a thing until you came along," Brian confessed, his eyes avoiding Edward's gaze. Jean intervened. "Well, would you like me to send Guile? Or do we have a deal?" His voice was calm, but carried an underlying threat that was impossible to ignore. Brian let out a scornful laugh. "Do your worst," he challenged, a mix of defiance and resignation in his tone. Edward stood there, his heart pounding as he processed the revelation. Brian, a long-time acquaintance, harboured feelings for Amelia and had somehow entangled himself in dark arts to claim her. The night grew heavier with tension, the confrontation reaching a critical point. Jean, assessing Brian's defiance, knew that they were dealing with a situation far more complex and dangerous than a mere rivalry. The stakes were high, and it was clear that retrieving Amelia's soul would require more than just threats. A battle of wills, of dark versus light, had just begun on the doorstep of Brian's old house. In the quiet of Edward's home, John approached Guile, his presence animating a sense of impending action. "It's time," John said firmly, his voice cutting through the stillness of the room. For the first time, a glint of something resembling emotion flickered across Gile's otherwise impassive face. Slowly, he began to shuffle towards the door, his movements deliberate and foreboding. "We must stay here with Amelia, or she could be lost forever," Jean cautioned Edward, his tone underscored with urgency. And then, the payment. "Anything," Edward replied without hesitation, his voice a testament to his unwavering love for Amelia. Meanwhile, at Brian's home, the man sat smugly, a false air of confidence around him. "What can they do to me?" he muttered to himself, unaware of the forces he had recklessly tampered with. Suddenly, a strange noise pierced the silence. Brian turned, and from the shadows emerged Guile, now more decayed than before, a terrifying spectre of his former self. "No!" Brian screamed, his facade of bravado crumbling in the face of this unearthly apparition. Back at Edward's home, at that very moment, Jean spoke with a sense of finality. "It is done." Amelia, as if awakened from a long, dark dream, sat up and uttered, "Edward?" The couple embraced, a moment of joy amidst the surreal events unfolding around them. As they held each other, Guile re-entered the room, his form now almost skeletal, a mere shadow of his former self. He sat in a chair, and after a few moments, he disappeared completely, as if reclaimed by the shadows from which he had emerged. "What happened to Guile?" Edward asked, his voice filled with a mix of awe and fear. "The spirits take a heavy toll," Jean replied solemnly. "Now, let's get down to payment, shall we?" Edward, still in the throes of relief at Amelia's recovery, reached for his checkbook. "Anything," he said, ready to pay any monetary price. "You cannot pay the spirits in money, dear boy," Jean said, a grave look in his eyes. "I'll be needing a new guardian. Let me know when you're ready." Edward's heart sank as realization dawned on him. The price for Amelia's recovery was not monetary, but a sacrifice, far more personal. He would have to take Gile's place as the guardian, a lifeless sentinel bound by the spirit world's demands. Amelia, understanding the grim reality, cried out, "No, Edward!" But Edward, looking into the eyes of his beloved wife, knew his decision. "It's worth it," he said, a resolve born of love steeling his voice. With a nod to John, Edward braced himself. John uttered a single, unrecognizable word, and the transformation began. Edward's features changed. Life seemed to ebb from his body, and he grew thin and gaunt, the expression of life swiftly leaving his face. He stood, now a lifeless guardian, the price of the spirits. In that moment, Edward's sacrifice for Amelia was complete, a testament to his undying love for her. He became the new sentinel, a guardian, bound to the spirit world, paying the ultimate price for meddling in the forces beyond mortal understanding. And if you're still looking to fulfill your thirst for more horror, don't forget to check out this next video, unless of course you are frozen with fear already.